You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Because Robert Newburgh at this point says, okay, I realize that everyone thinks I'm a buggerer. I'm not going to change anybody's mind on this. I'm going to make the argument that it doesn't matter. He says, these rumors don't matter. You've told rumors about what I'm wearing. You've joked about my clothes. You've told all these nasty stories about me. Why does this matter? Why does this mean I can't be a chaplain in this unit? And that I find so moving, because that I think is really the heart of the Enlightenment. His way of saying the personal is not political. What I do in my personal life, what I may or may not do, how I dress, what I say, what rumors are said about me, these shouldn't matter to me doing my job and being treated equally to everyone else.
Hello, and welcome to episode 414 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. June is Pride Month, a time when we purposely reflect on the ongoing struggles and contributions of LGBTQIA+ individuals throughout history and today. It's a time when we should ask, how do we uncover queer lives from the distant past, especially in an era when language and records often erased and obscured them? Or what did queerness look like in early America, and how might it have intersected with power, religion, and empire on the eve of the American Revolution? John McCurdy, a professor of history and philosophy at Eastern Michigan University and author of the book Vicious and Immoral, Homosexuality, the American Revolution, and the Trials of Robert Newburgh, joins us to explore these questions through the remarkable story of Robert Newburgh, an 18th century British Army chaplain whose life and court-martial proceedings open a rare window onto early modern ideas about gender, sexuality, and identity. Now, drawing on court records, correspondence, and military archives, John helps us investigate how 18th century Britons understood and policed same-sex behavior, why Robert Newburgh's sexuality and character became central to his military service, and what Robert Newburgh's story reveals to us about the British Empire's treatment of queerness and about the historical challenges of naming and recovering LGBTQIA+ lives in the past. But first, we have a fun new episode for you next week. It commemorates the 4th of July by exploring the most frequently asked questions about the Declaration of Independence. Plus, we answer all of the questions that you sent in about this founding document as well. So if you're not already following Ben Franklin's World in your favorite podcast app, please do so, because I don't want you to miss this great episode. Okay, are you ready to meet Robert Newburgh and see what his life reveals about homosexuality and queerness on the eve of the American Revolution? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history and philosophy at Eastern Michigan University. His research expertise is in the fields of colonial and revolutionary America, gender, and LGBTQ+ history. He is the author of 3 books, including Quarters, The Accommodation of the British Army and the Coming of the American Revolution, and, most recently, Vicious and Immoral, Homosexuality, the American Revolution, and the Trials of Robert Newburgh. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, John McCurdy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, in Vicious and Immoral, John uses the court-martial proceedings against British chaplain Robert Newburgh as a window onto the British military on the eve of the American Revolution and onto 18th century British and American ideas about queerness. John, who was Robert Newburgh and how did you find him? What made you want to write a book about this unknown chaplain's court-martial proceedings?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I had previously written a book called Quarters, which I researched primarily at the William Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And while I was researching that, I came upon this trial transcript that had something to do with buggery. And when I read through it, I realized I didn't know any of the names of the people involved. It wasn't related to quartering British soldiers. So I set it aside. I thought, well, maybe this could be an article or something like that. After I finished Quarters, I started digging around. Could I do something with this strange little trial and these people I didn't recognize? I did some more research. I went to the UK National Archives at Kew. I found 6 more trials related to Robert Newburgh, who was the man I focused on in the original trial. And these were all over about a 2-year period of time. These were incredibly detailed. And I thought, well, this isn't going to make a very good article because it'll take me forever to explain who all these people are and what's going on in order to get to the point I want to get to, which is the sexuality, the buggery part. So I decided a book would be the best form of dissemination, that I could really delve into the stories of the individuals. And so I decided I was going to make it a microhistory and really focus on this one person, his experiences, the various cases it involved. And I thought maybe this could be part of a larger work, but I didn't want this story to get lost. I didn't want this to be one chapter out of a series of other chapters, and then it would lose a lot of this detail.
I had this on my list of questions to ask you a bit later, but can we talk about the terminology that we're going to use to discuss ideas about gender, sexuality, and homosexuality in the 18th century? You've already used the terms queerness and buggery, and your title uses the term homosexuality. So what language should we use and will we use so that we can be respectful of both the people from the past and our own modern ideas of homosexuality?
Sure. The terminology is a real problem. Maybe the problems are too strong of a word, but it's a bit of a pain sometimes to deal with because obviously the term homosexual doesn't exist in the 18th century. It's a 19th century invention. So the terminology is always shifting, and with that changing terminology is also changing ideas. So when we talk about homosexual, that's a person with a specific identity. I am a gay man. I identify as a homosexual. But you not only do not have that term existing in the 18th century, you aren't really going to have people saying, I identify as a whatever they would have called them. So the terminology is one of the issues to go with. Looking through the materials related to Robert Newburgh, the term that is preferred is buggery and buggerer. And this is a term that comes into popularity really in the 16th century in England. It's connected to a law. There's a law passed under Henry VIII that makes both sodomy and bestiality capital crime. So buggery can encompass both of those. And that's the term that's used. Occasionally, sodomy is referred to. Occasionally, there's some other terms to complicate this even further. Many times when people are talking about same-sex intimacy, they don't want to give a name to it. So that's also interesting. Sometimes you're reading through these records thinking, I think they're talking about this, but I'm not entirely sure.
Is the fact that in our own modern day, we have many terms to discuss queerness, but in the 18th century, there were so few terms to use to discuss queerness. Is that part of what makes researching LGBTQ AI plus topics in early America so difficult?
I think so, yeah. So this is one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, in addition to I thought it was just a great story. But it's really hard to find good sources. If you look through legal sources connected to sodomy trials, one, that's a problem because you're looking at certain type of documentation. You're really not getting the people themselves talking about what they experienced. But they're also very short. Courts martial, records from the Old Bailey, legal cases, they're all very brief. There's usually a couple sentences. There are also good 18th century sources that are literary and popular, sort of making fun of people for being queer or what we would call queer, but these aren't usually attached to actual people. So the sources are really hard to get a handle on. And I think that this is why a lot of historians have shied away from trying to connect the revolution to LGBTQ plus issues, which is something I wanted to do in this book. Historians of the revolution, I am one, tend to not do this, get into sexuality. Again, there's a lack of sources. It's hard to make a case if you don't have good sources. But also historians of sexuality, specifically queer scholars, don't really look into the revolution. It's hard to think about that event or that series of events and how it connects to changing ideas of identity. William Benneman, I think, is the only person I've read who tries to put these two together in some way. But I thought that Robert Newburgh's trial would be an opportunity to do this because the sources I found were so rich. They are explicit in descriptions of what people are doing, what people are saying about Newburgh, and they're also happening on the eve of the American Revolution. The court-martial that makes up the bulk of the book takes place in 1774. Various people in the trial are involved in the American Revolution, either on one side of the war or the other. And I think most importantly, the ideas of the American Revolution come through in what we see in the trials.
Well, let's dig through these sources and the fascinating story of Robert Newburgh. Now, Robert Newburgh was from Ireland, where England, later Great Britain, experimented with colonization programs long before it even attempted to colonize North America. John, would you tell us about Ireland and England, later Great Britain's colonization practices there, and why this history is essential for our understanding of the context for Robert Newburgh and the American Revolution?
Sure. So Ireland in the 18th century was really a British colony. This was, of course, a conquest that stretched back hundreds of years. But by the 18th century, it was people of English descent who controlled most of the land. They controlled almost all of the power. They controlled Parliament. They had forced the native Irish, the Gaels, out of power. They passed Test Acts and other laws against Roman Catholics to keep them out of power, to keep them from having control of their own country. But then this also meant that Ireland was a place for the ambitious Englishman and lesser ambitious English woman to come and really make a name for themselves. That this was a place where they could initially find land and become great. And we see this in Newburgh's family in particular. So his grandfathers were both large landowners, or what would have been called planters. In fact, you can go to Ireland and still see the mansions that these two men built. They're gorgeous. They have already become great. Robert's father, Arthur, goes a little bit different, and we see sort of a shift in how Ireland's changing by the 18th century. He becomes involved in linen manufacturing. Ireland will become very powerful and rich because there is this growing class of people like Arthur Newburgh who are starting to begin what we'll later know as the market revolution. And so it's that type of ambition that's going to get going. The final point I would make, thinking about Ireland, especially in comparison to North America, is that by the 18th century, you already have Anglo-Irish people, is what we would call them, who are saying, we don't want to be a colony anymore. We should rule ourselves. They've become critical of Parliament. They're critical of the king. Some of these people call themselves patriots. They start planning out independence. And we know that eventually the Irish people will launch an independence movement against England in 1798. Unfortunately, it's a huge failure, and Ireland is even more colonized and conquered by the British by that point.
And what do we know about Robert Newburgh and his life in Ireland? How did Robert Newburgh fit within the bigger story of English colonization in Ireland?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, his father was part of the linen board, and this gave the family some money, gave them some prominence. But the Newburghs, they're not at the top. Robert's father doesn't sit in Parliament. His grandfathers have, but his father doesn't. They don't have access to that top power. In many ways, we would describe the Newburghs as a middling sort. Middle class doesn't really work here, but this is a group that is going to become more powerful based upon work and knowledge. Robert is born in Donnybrook in 1742. Donnybrook is a suburb on the south side of Dublin, which also means this is also putting Robert and his family in a city, Dublin, that's growing, very much like Philadelphia in this moment. It's expanding from sort of a little village into this major world metropolitan area. Robert, we know, grows up with some privilege. He speaks Latin. He knows horse riding. He has a private tutor, is how he learns his studies, which is interesting because most middling men at this era would have gone to a diocesan school. He has servants. We know that the family has a number of servants. The last thing that's really important about Robert Newburgh's boyhood is that he's sickly. He's a sickly child, and this follows him throughout his life. And one of the reasons we know this is because of the sickness that we know he has a servant who's personally attached to him, basically a valet, who will follow him around and be quite intimate with Robert in his boyhood and also as a young man.
Something else I found interesting about Robert Newburgh's early life, in your book, Vicious and Immoral, you note that he was a younger son, and yet his family paid for him to go to Trinity College and receive this high-quality education. And in North America during the same time period, college was something that was financially out of reach for most middling families.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I don't know how expensive Trinity would have been. Again, the family seemed to have enough money to send him there. He doesn't receive a scholarship, as some people who attend Trinity do. So the family has enough money to send him. But again, I think this is his inheritance. So the older brothers receive land or other gifts from grandparents and the parents. I think this is what Robert received. And in some sense, it's almost like the aristocratic families of the same era, where the oldest son gets the right of primogeniture, gets all the land. The younger sons go into one of the professions, either the church or the army. Robert goes into both.
Yeah, and why do you think Robert went into the Anglican ministry? And how would he have even gone about becoming an Anglican priest? Did you ever find what the allure of religion was for Robert Newburgh?
That's a good question, because one of the things I was frustrated by in my research, Robert doesn't leave behind sermons or religious tracts. He doesn't seem to ever write these. So it's hard to get a sense of his theology and his religiosity. Like, why is he drawn to the church? And I think there's the sort of the practical matter. You could say, well, if you go into the priesthood, you're going to find steady work. For some, it can become an access to power, an influence. But I also think, reading through the court martials, Robert Newburgh has a great deal of Christian compassion. And I think this is what truly brings him into the church and motivates him to be a priest. The final piece of this is he has an uncle. His mother's brother, Henry, had also attended Trinity, had also become an Anglican priest. I think Robert, it looks like, probably studies with his uncle, and this is how he learned to become a priest. There's not really a seminary in that sense in the 18th century. I mean, there's not really medical schools or law schools either. You go to college, receive a basic education, and then you go and apprentice a man who's doing that profession. And this is probably what Robert does. He probably studies with his uncle, Henry, up in Tyrone County and learns to become a priest that way.
You mentioned that Newburgh had a great sense of Christian compassion. So we can best understand Robert, what did Christian compassion mean in the 18th century?
So Robert is a man of great privilege, but I also think he's not focused just on becoming greater and wealthier. He really does seem to take an interest in men who are struggling, in lower men, in those who don't have as much as him. And we really see this in the army when he takes on a case of a private who finds himself in a world of hurt based on a series of bad choices. And Robert says, I got to be the person who stands up for him. And I think we see that sort of throughout his life. The other thing I would connect this to is there is this emerging notion. I mean, the Enlightenment is starting to have an effect upon Anglicanism in the 18th century. They're not moving away from the God-centered universe per se, but moving toward a notion of there is a general human family that all humans are obliged to help each other. It'd be a very rudimentary form of what we would later recognize as equality, of a human equality. And that's happening here. And I think Robert is maybe some of this first generation starting to say, it's not just about privilege, it's not just about eliteness. I have a connection to much more common men than myself.
Now, when we've spoken with other scholars about the 18th century British Army, it seemed to be the place where you would go if you had no other choice. The army is where you could go to make a living wage, have clothing on your back, food in your belly, and a roof over your head. And this situation, of course, was for regular soldiers, not for officers and more elite men like Robert Newburgh. But John, you make the point in your book, Vicious and Immoral, that when elite younger sons like Robert Newburgh needed a profession, they would sometimes join the army, especially if they didn't stand to inherit a large estate or a big tract of land or a sum of money. So what do we know about Robert Newburgh's decision to join the British Army as a chaplain? Was this a decision made because he failed to make a living as a civilian chaplain in Ireland?
That's a good point. So his uncle had a pretty nice parish, and he was earning about £300 a year. So that's not bad money in the 18th century. Robert can't quite land a parish. He never becomes a rector, which would be sort of an established minister in a church. Rather, he's a curate. He spends 3 or 4 years basically as a religious journeyman, going from place to place. Some places would come with a parsonage, some would not. But he was making about £60 a year, which is considerably less. And again, I think anyone would understand this. Like, you can do that for a few years, but that's hard to imagine that being your entire life. So I think he sees the army as it's going to be a form of pay. There's going to be some opportunities for advancement. It's going to be more stable. There's going to be more opportunities there than he's going to find in the Church of Ireland. The other point I would add to the army is Robert's choosing to go into the army, right? He has to purchase his way in. And he's doing this because he wants to. And he says in one of his writings, he wants to see America. He wants to travel. He wants some of that adventure. This is very common, I think, with other young men who join the army, whether as officers or enlisted men, that there's some allure, especially for an ambitious man. You might go into the army and spend some time in North America, after which you can leave the army, acquire land, maybe find a wife, have a family. So those would also be potential motivations for Robert Newburgh to join the army.
In our American context, we're used to people joining the army or any division of the armed service, and maybe they start out as a junior officer or an enlisted person, but they work their way up the leadership ladder. That leadership is really determined by merit. But it sounds like in the 18th century British Army, leadership was about the cost of a commission and whether someone could afford to buy their rank in the army. So would you tell us a bit more about the British Army and its structure and what its leadership was like if wealthy second and third sons could just buy their commissions?
Sort of the old adage of the army is it follows the English society already, right? Of commons, lords, and king. King is the head of the whole thing. The aristocrats make up the officer corps, and the common people make up the enlisted ranks. It's not entirely what's going on by the 18th century, but there's a hint of that there. So you have to purchase your way in. We don't have records of Robert Newburgh's purchase of a commission. It probably was about £500, which, again, comparing to the fact that his uncle was earning £300 a year, thought that was pretty good money. It's a sizable investment. But it's also not money that's lost. So Robert purchases a commission in the army for probably around £500. When he leaves the army, he can sell his commission again and will get that money back. While he's in the army, he will make a salary. He will be, of course, charged for his food, his clothes, anything else he wants, but he will have enough money to certainly get by and maybe save a little on the side. Some men do go up through the ranks, so usually you would purchase as an ensign or a lieutenant and then be promoted up into a captaincy or on up. This would take many years. It'd be more difficult for Robert to do this because he's purchasing a chaplaincy, which is sort of a rank by itself. There's no promotion as chaplain. You don't become super chaplain. That's going to be his status within the army.
And what about the Royal Irish Army Regiment that Newburgh joined? You make it clear in Vicious and Immoral that Newburgh had to do a bit of research about which regiment he should join, and then he had to do a bit of politicking to be able to get his commission in the regiment. So would you tell us why Robert chose to buy a commission in the Royal Irish Regiment?
The Royal Irish Regiment comes out of the 17th century, part of England's colonization and conquest of Ireland. They formed this regiment. By the 18th century, the Royal Irish Regiment is renumbered the 18th Regiment and is part of just Britain's worldwide army. Since part of the War of Spanish Succession in Minorca, returns to England and Ireland for the War of Austrian Succession, and then will be sent to North America in 1767 as part of Britain's attempt to control its new colonies. There's evidence that Robert tries to purchase a commission as a chaplain in another regiment, in the 47th Regiment, and that this might be one of the places where one of the initial problems with a reputation, which we'll get into here in a minute. Because the story gets told later that he goes to the commanding officer of the 47th Regiment to purchase a commission as a chaplain, and they basically tell him no, that he has this bad reputation. And they don't tell him this at the time. They just say, we don't have anything available, and goes to the 18th Regiment and purchases a commission there. And the 18th Regiment's a good place for Robert to go. Like I said, a few years before he purchased his commission, the 18th Regiment has shipped out to North America. They are part of Britain's attempt to really take control of this new land they've won in the 7 Years' War. In fact, the 18th Regiment gets sent to Illinois, to the edge of the Mississippi River, right at the very western edge of the British Empire. They're surrounded by indigenous people, by French-speaking colonists. They feel very alone, very out of whack. The 18th Regiment arrives in 1767, a very healthy regiment. There's a commanding officer. There are 9 companies, each with NCOs and officers, about 40 men per company, wives, children. It's a very healthy-looking regiment. The time in Illinois is terrible for the 18th Regiment. Many men die, family members die, children die. It's boring. They're stuck out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nobody that looks like them or speaks like them. They get into fights, they get drunk. And at the end, a cabal of officers topple the commanding officer. They topple Lieutenant Colonel John Wilkins and send him packing, really leaving this unit in shambles. In early 1772, they're recalled back to Pennsylvania and will take up residence in the Philadelphia barracks, by which point the 18th Regiment is really a shadow of what it once been. And that's about the time Robert Newburgh joins them.
What was Robert Newburgh's reputation, and why did it prove problematic for him that his reputation, or rumors about his reputation, preceded him to the 18th Regiment in Philadelphia?
So the evidence we have is the first time Robert Newburgh is accused of buggery comes in May of 1773. So the previous fall, he purchased his commission. He's in Dublin at the time, and the British Army is leaving from Cork. Cork is the big place where everyone leaves Ireland from. So he makes his way down to Cork. He's waiting for it to be spring so he can find a ship to sail to North America and join his unit. In May of 1773, Robert Newburgh receives a letter from Thomas Batt, in which Batt says, "I've heard a story about you sleeping with your servant. This is a terrible story. This has impugned your character. You should not be in this unit. You will bring disgrace upon the 18th Regiment. You need to clear up these rumors before you join the army." Robert Newburgh says that this is the first time he's ever heard these rumors, but the evidence comes out later that these rumors have been circulating for a while, because the incident that Thomas Batt is referring to actually goes back to 1769, 4 years earlier, when Robert Newburgh had gone on a trip to Sligo on the west coast of Ireland and had taken his servant with him. That's not unusual for a well-born man to have a servant, a personal servant with him. But the story that gets told is that the landlady goes to clean the room and says, "Well, I noticed that I set out 2 beds, one for the master and one for the servant. The servant's bed was not slept in." And so there's this story that, well, the servant has been sleeping with his master, has been sleeping with Robert Newburgh. And this story gets told around Ireland. Apparently, Robert Newburgh doesn't know this, but the story is reported in various places in Ireland between 1769 and then when it finally makes its way to Robert Newburgh in 1773. So people all over Ireland are talking about him and his servant and what they may or may not have been doing.
I find it fascinating that, at least on the face of it, Robert Newburgh seems to have no idea that this rumor about him being a buggerer is circulating around Ireland. And of course, this caused him to seem very surprised when Batt confronts him with this rumor.
Yes, I don't have a reason to think that Newburgh is lying in that. But again, Ireland's not that big. The people that Newburgh would know, and there's not that many people of importance that he would be in contact with. It is hard to imagine that the story wouldn't get told or wouldn't make its way back to him. There's also something about that I think is particularly related to queer history here is that homosexuality, queerness, there's a blue humor to it, especially in the 18th century. So I think a lot of guys like to tell these stories, and these stories get told a lot because what begins as a rumor gets turned into a story, gets turned into a joke. When Captain Bat hears the story, he doesn't just hear, oh, there's this guy who's about to be a chaplain who slept with a servant. Rather, he hears stories of, oh, you don't want to be on the same ship when you sail to America, because Bat had previously been a captain in the 18th Regiment and has sold out, but he's heading back to Philadelphia to open a wine shop. He's married, he's left the army, he's going to become a civilian now. But he's also looking for passage back to America. And he hears a story, you should not sail with this man on your ship, because he's going to try to bugger you. And this story gets told to him by a couple of different people. By the time the story gets to Thomas Bat, it's not just, oh, there was some inappropriate sleeping. And to be truthful, it wasn't unusual for two men to sleep in the same bed in the 18th century. Rather, this has become a much bigger story, a much bigger claim of Robert Newburgh's a sexual predator. He's a corrupt person. He has poor character. It had become a much bigger deal than just who he was sleeping with.
I don't know if it was possible for you to tell, given the sources you had, but was the worry among the army that Newburgh was, as we would say today, that Newburgh was a gay man? Were the soldiers worried that Robert Newburgh might come on to them, ask them out on a date? Or was the fact that Newburgh was different in his displays of masculinity, in his dress, his mannerisms, plus he was a man of God, is that what caused a sense of fear and anger around the Royal Irish Regiment about Newburgh's arrival?
Yeah, I think it's several of those points. So I think religious figures, religious leaders, priests, always, there's a queerness to them there. I mean, that's not going to be unusual to anybody in the 18th century. And mostly wouldn't be thought of as sexual. It would just be, you have this guy in the army who has a commission, but he's not there to fight. He's there to basically take care of dying men, to give last rites, do things that aren't really military. So there's already an oddness to a chaplain. But I think also with the story of how we should think about Newburgh in this is, the story comes that he's been sleeping with his servant. The stories have become more and more fantastic because they've circulated around Ireland. And then he does nothing to allay fears of the men who are telling these stories and hearing these stories. I describe him, he's a very difficult person. Robert Newburgh will not take anything lightly. He's very fussy. He's very litigious. He talks back. He's not one who's going to play along, right? He's not going to go along to get along. And I think that also irritates people. And I think then connects back to this idea of he's a problem, and that problem might actually be that he's this kind of buggerer, that there's something corrupt in his character. Because this is one of the things I found so interesting in how the trial transcripts kind of play out, that early on, men like Thomas Bat will say, you're accused of the specific crime. You're accused of having had sex with a man. And they go into detail of what this is. And here's where we get the fantastic stories. But it doesn't look like Robert Newburgh ever repeats this once he makes it to America and once he's in the army. So there's no hard evidence for the army to attack him as being a sexual being, a man who's having sex. They can't prosecute him for that. So they start talking about his character. They start talking about he's a man of poor morals. He's a man who doesn't go along. He's a man who doesn't know his place. There's something corrupt and immoral about him. And I find this very interesting because looking at the 18th century, historians of sexuality usually say, we don't really have homosexuals in the 18th century because we don't have people who say, I am a homosexual. This is how I identify. This is my identity. And I think that's true. But for people looking from the outside in the 18th century, I think they're starting to see more of this. And I think the word character is one way of describing that they are beginning to identify that there are certain men who are just different. And that difference is connected intimately to their same-sex actions, or at least their same-sex desire.
So Thomas Bat meets Robert Newburgh as they're both preparing to set sail for Philadelphia. And Bat tells Newburgh that before he leaves Ireland, he really needs to clear up his reputation as a buggerer. Like, don't join the regiment until you've done this. As we have a bit of suspense here, what did Robert Newburgh do next? Let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsors, and then let's find out what Robert Newburgh did. Do you ever find yourself wanting to talk more about what you just heard on this show? Perhaps you have a burning follow-up question or your own time warp question that you'd love to ask and have others think through? Well, good news, there's a place for that. Come join me in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. It's where people who love history and this podcast gather to dive deeper into episode topics, share thoughts and ideas, and connect with other curious minds who love early American history. It's a fun and welcoming space, so I'd love to have you there. Come join us at benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Facebook. Come be a part of the conversation and bring your historical curiosity with you. John, what did Robert Newburgh do after Thomas Batt tells him that he needs to clear his name before he joins his regiment in Philadelphia?
So Robert Newburgh finally finds someone to take him across the ocean. Batt precedes him by about a month. So Thomas Batt arrives in Philadelphia, which is where the 18th Regiment was stationed. He connects back with his old friends and starts telling them stories. There is the chaplain on the way. He did horrible things. Let me give you all the details. Robert Newburgh arrives in Philadelphia in September of 1773. His sickness slows him down, his sort of perpetual illness that he always seems to have. When he gets to Philadelphia in September of 1773, he's initially pretty well welcomed. A number of officers who will later turn against him are cordial. He becomes very close friends with two subalterns. Subalterns are for what we call officers who are below the rank of captain. So there's a Lieutenant Alexander Fowler and an Ensign Nicholas Trist. They're very friendly with Newburgh. They start having meetings. They discuss history. They discuss religion. They become quite good friends with Robert Newburgh as well. Robert Newburgh also was able to hire a servant. Officers in the British Army in the 18th century would hire a servant. This wouldn't be someone from outside the military, but rather would be an enlisted man who would earn an extra pence or a couple of shillings for doing the service. Early on, things seem to be okay with Robert Newburgh when he arrives. Things seem to change by about November. And there's one incident in particular that always seems to be a pivot point because it comes up later in the trial. And this is when one of the captains, Benjamin Chaplain, is out visiting the secretary to the governor of New York. They're out in rural Pennsylvania, somewhere between Philadelphia and New York. They're having a lovely walk. And this guy goes riding by on a horse, dressed very flamboyantly. And the secretary turns to the captain and says, "Oh my God, who was that? Like, whose groomsman was that?" Just sort of appalled by what this man looked like. And Chaplain says, "Well, that's actually our chaplain." The secretary to the governor of New York is horrified. He says, "That guy looks like a jockey. He looks like a groomsman. He does not look like a chaplain. He does not look like a religious man at all." This embarrasses Chaplain. Chaplain then goes back to the Philadelphia barracks. And this is when Chaplain really turns against Robert Newburgh. And Chapman's probably the most powerful of the captains in the regiment. He's certainly the most influential. So by late November, early December, everyone in the 18th Regiment knows, do not go to Newburgh. He's a bad man. He has a bad reputation. You don't want to be associated with him. And this really changes Robert Newburgh's experience because early on things have been okay, but now no enlisted man will come to him. No one will come to him for spiritual guidance. He can't do his job. And he's kind of stuck. And he's like, well, I'm going to have to seek further recourse.
And what sort of recourse could Robert Newburgh seek at this point? Soldiers have talked about his reputation even before he arrived in Philadelphia, and they issue these seemingly baseless charges against his reputation, which leaves Newburgh unable to serve in his post. Could the British Army have thrown Newburgh out of the army as incapable of doing his job at this point because of all these rumors?
It would be difficult because he has his commission. So he could have his commission canceled or revoked, but that would be very extreme. No, his sort of the thing he's told to do is, well, go talk to your commanding officer. So there's Major Isaac Hamilton is at this point commanding the 18th Regiment. And Hamilton's a weak leader. And Hamilton says, well, I don't know what we can really do here. Finally, Hamilton will say, well, why don't you just go back to Ireland? All of these rumors seem to come from Ireland. Why don't you just go back there, silence the rumors, and then you can come back and join us. Your reputation will be cleared and all these nasty stories will go away. But Newburgh knows that this won't work. If he leaves Philadelphia, leaves his regiment with this cloud over his head, he's probably never coming back. And this is going to be a problem. He realizes that if he wants to preserve his commission, preserve his rank in the army, he's going to have to stay and fight. And so with the commanding officer not really giving him any help, Robert Newburgh turns to civil officials. He sues Thomas Batt. He says, you have been talking about me behind my back, calling me all sorts of nasty things. That's illegal. I want civil damages. And so files case in court. And this is where the trials start beginning with civil trials. Nothing really comes out of it. But what Newburgh is wanting is he wants Thomas Batt and then later other men who have accused him of buggery to say, I was wrong. This man is not a buggerer. There's no problem here. They won't do it. They won't do it. And the civil courts then as now stretch on. Justice moves very slowly. So then Robert Newburgh starts looking for other avenues to improve his reputation. He insists on a court-martial against the adjutant. In December of 1773, he goes to live in the barracks. When Robert Newburgh first arrives, he lives in a tavern in Philadelphia. And I think this is because he doesn't really understand how the army works. He's not from a military family. It's his first time in the army. And he's like, well, I'm an officer. I'll just do what I want. I'll stay where I want. Orders bread and beef and sends the bill to the army, to the quartermaster and the adjutant, at which point he's told, no. If you want the army to feed you, you have to come live in the barracks. He goes to the barracks and he selects a couple of rooms. He says, these are 2 rooms I would like to live in, one for me and one for my firewood. And the adjutant says, no, I don't want to give you that room. I'm giving you a different room. Robert Newburgh takes this as a slight, that he's getting lesser than a man of his rank should get. And Newburgh also wonders, is this guy treating me differently because of these rumors about me and my sexuality? And so Robert Newburgh insists that the adjutant and quartermaster be court-martialed. Again, trying to get them to say, we were wrong. This man is not a buggerer. He's perfectly fine. Everything that's been said about him is not true.
I know we want to dive into Robert Newburgh's court-martials because, of course, Robert Newburgh has more than one court-martial. But before we dive in, John, what do we mean when we say court-martial? What action is Robert Newburgh asking the British Army to take on his behalf?
There are 2 types of court-martials. The most common one is a regimental court-martial. So the most common problems in the army are a man's off duty, or he falls asleep when he's supposed to be keeping watch, or he gets drunk, something like that. And for those, you'll have a regimental court-martial, which is usually pretty quick, maybe the course of an hour. And the army, that particular unit just decides, you were in the wrong, here's your punishment, and they move on. An officer, and a chaplain who would be considered an officer, doesn't get that treatment. He gets a much better treatment. He gets what's called a general court-martial. A general court-martial has to be ordered by a general, hence the name, but it's made up of men from officers from other units. Other regiments will come and sit as a jury to sit in judgment of the person. General court-martials are sort of interesting. In the big one that will come in August of 1774 that ultimately decides the case, Captain Chaplain is the one who will serve as the army's prosecution, but Robert Newburgh is left on his own to come up with his own defense. It's clear that he has legal experts in Philadelphia and that area who are advising him, but he's basically his own defense attorney.
Why was he left alone to make his defense? Did the army not have lawyers to represent people in court-martials during the 18th century? It just seems like the advice out there that one always hears about is don't defend yourself, but perhaps that's just modern advice.
It is. The problem that they reach is the army can decide to seal itself off from the civilian community. And so no civilians are allowed at Robert Newburgh's courts-martial. And so this is the problem. All of his lawyers are civilians, and the army just won't allow them in. So they're like, yeah, you're on your own, man.
Now, Robert Newburgh had a couple of different court-martial proceedings. Would you provide us with an overview of Newburgh's request for court-martials and what happened during these different proceedings?
So there's the court-martial where he court-martials the quartermaster and adjutant, which doesn't work out for him. The quartermaster and adjutant is found to be fine. He's not said anything wrong. The army has a court of inquiry. So this is sort of like a pre-trial trial. Is there enough evidence to move forward toward a general court-martial? So they have one of these among the unit. This is also inconclusive and doesn't settle the matter. So this is why Robert Newburgh keeps pushing for a general court-martial. He keeps just ratcheting it up, trying to say, I'm going to need as authoritative of a voice as I can to say, I am not a buggerer. I have not done wrong. I should take my place as chaplain in this unit and return to my business. There's a reluctance to give him a court-martial. The army doesn't want to grant one. The commander-in-chief of North America at this point is Thomas Gage, General Gage. General Gage does not want a court-martial. He says, we don't have the evidence. This is just going to make everybody upset. And this is a regiment that's already a mess. This is going to make matters much, much worse. But Gage eventually will say, but apparently there's no other way of settling this matter. Everyone is in such high dudgeon that Gage will order the court-martial against his own wishes. So the idea is this is going to be a general court-martial that's going to solve this issue. It's taken out of the hands of the regiment. So Newburgh and those men who are prosecuting this case and witnesses, they all leave Philadelphia and go to New York City. So the matters can be closer to legal officials within the British Army, and also to be surrounded by men who are not on the 18th Regiment who will be sitting in judgment of Robert Newburgh.
Interestingly, in Vicious and Immoral, your book, you note that Robert Newburgh mostly wanted a court-martial proceeding because he wanted to prove that he wasn't a buggerer. But when he finally received permission from General Thomas Gage to have a court-martial, Gage stipulated that he couldn't have a trial about whether he was a buggerer because Gage didn't want the British Army dealing with this issue of sexuality.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing, and I'm guessing at some parts of this, but in order to get the court-martial, in order to force the court-martial, to force Gage's hand, Newburgh convinces an enlisted man to say, I won't serve under this chaplain because of his reputation, because he's a buggerer. And it's interesting because Newburgh admits that he did all of this behind the scenes, that he got this guy to make this accusation. Part of this logic is the man who makes the accusation is married. He's just had a child. He's very conspicuously heterosexual. So there's no insinuation that Newburgh and this man had been having a sexual relationship. So the man says, I can't serve under this man because the chaplain is a buggerer. At which point then the army has to act like a formal crime has been accused. But the army also realizes, and I'm not sure how much of this is the army and how much of this is Captain Chaplain, says, well, this is going to be impossible to prove. Again, we don't have evidence. No one will come forward and say they've had sex with this man. No one's seen them in flagrante delicto. Like there's no one has seen Robert Newburgh and another man having sex. This is going to be impossible to prove. And we don't actually need it. By this point, we have all this other evidence from previous courts-martial that we can accuse Newburgh of lying under oath, of telling falsehoods, of disrespecting his commanding officer, of manipulating enlisted men to defy their superiors. We have plenty of stuff, plenty of charges, and much more solid evidence. And so when Chapman begins the case, he says, I'm not going to prosecute him for buggery. I'm going to let that aside. But this is, I think, the thing that's important here. The army doesn't prosecute Newburgh for buggery, but they do prosecute him as a buggerer. So laced through all the other charges is this idea that he is a corrupt man. He's looking to defy the moral order, upend natural hierarchy, and destroy the army and possibly the British army from the inside, all of which is linked to his sexual desire.
So from this standpoint, Newburgh was trying to clear his reputation to say, I am not a buggerer. I'm actually an upstanding subject. And Chapman argued for the army, saying that we don't know if he is or isn't a buggerer. We just know that Newburgh has a bad reputation and we want him to leave the army.
Right. Had Robert Newburgh been accused in the criminal court of sodomy, he could have been put to death. The army is not seeking that type of recourse. They don't want to prosecute him as a buggerer. They just want him to leave. They want him to go back to Ireland, go to another unit, do something else. That is their MO here.
So what happened with this strategy? How did Newburgh's penultimate August 1774 court-martial play out?
Sure. So it's quite a trial. It goes on for 3 weeks. The transcript of the court-martial is about 200 pages. This is a massive case that goes on and on. There are dozens of witnesses. It's a long trial. And again, Captain Chapman is leading the prosecution and touches on all the various points. He disrespected his commanding officer. He told lies under oath, et cetera, et cetera. The heart of the Army's case revolves around Private Nicholas Gaffney. Private Nicholas Gaffney is a private in the 18th Regiment who had been out with the 18th Regiment when they were in Illinois. Was very unhappy in Illinois. When he comes back to Philadelphia with the rest of the unit, he starts becoming more unhappy. And he starts accusing his superior, his captain, John Shee, of corruption. He says, well, when we were back out in Illinois, you were selling goods to the men, to the soldiers at marked up prices and keeping all the good stuff for yourself. The problem is if you're an enlisted man and you accuse an officer, specifically your captain, of corruption, and you can't prove those charges, the captain will then turn around and prosecute you, which is what happens to Private Gaffney. So the Army prosecutes him. You've been speaking ill of your captain. You're being a problem. The Army holds a court-martial of Nicholas Gaffney. Nicholas Gaffney doesn't know what he's doing. He's a common man. He's a carpenter, doesn't have a lot of knowledge of reading. He's Irish. People have become very worried because they know that if he is found guilty, which he is found guilty, he's going to face severe punishment. So a group of people prevail upon Newburgh. And this I find an interesting part of the story. It's some elite men and women in Philadelphia. It's some civilians in Philadelphia who say, we've heard the story that there's an enlisted man who's going to trial. He's going to lose. And if he loses, he's going to be sentenced to 1,000 lashes. This is cruel. This is far crueler than anyone in America can imagine. And so they say, can you help this man? And Robert Newburgh says yes. And again, I think this is where his Christian compassion really comes out. He says, yes, this is my duty as a chaplain and also as a Christian. And Newburgh tries to arrange a lawyer to come meet with Gaffney. He can't get anyone to go there. And so finally, Newburgh says, I'll take over your defense. So he organizes some witnesses and writes Gaffney's closing argument at his court-martial. Gaffney is found guilty. He is convicted. He's sentenced to 1,000 lashes. He only receives a portion of that because they can't give him the full 1,000 because they're convinced they're going to kill him to give him that many lashes. But then the story comes out, and the story starts getting told as, this isn't Robert Newburgh, the chaplain, being compassionate and trying to help a guy who, ended up down on his luck. This is the heart of the buggerer. He is trying to sow dissension within the unit. Gaffney wouldn't have had this idea to accuse his captain of corruption had it not been for Newburgh undermining him and manipulating him. And so at Robert Newburgh's court-martial in August of 1774, the Army, Captain Chaplain, brings forward Private Gaffney. And they say, what happened? And Gaffney says, oh, well, while we were working on my defense back for my trial, we went to his room. We were alone in his room. We drank together. Robert Newburgh told very lewd stories. He made jokes about other cases involving pedophilia. This is a really corrupt man. And Gaffney, of course, never says, and Captain Chaplain never insinuates that Gaffney and Newburgh had a sexual relationship. He doesn't have to. It's this sense of the sexual underpinning to the whole thing. Newburgh, in his corrupt desire, he might have sexual designs on Gaffney or not. His real point is to undermine the British Army, which he hates, to bring it down. And so the Army brings forward Gaffney to say terrible things about Robert Newburgh, which Robert Newburgh's very offended by. He's like, I tried to help this guy, and now he's turning on me and saying all these terrible things about me, and is now the star witness in the case against me. That becomes the heart of the case. Newburgh also mounts a substantial defense. He calls forward a number of men to speak on his behalf, men to speak to his character. Lieutenant Fowler and Ensign Trist, his good friends in the 18th Regiment, come forward to speak on how good his character is. And then I think the final point I would just make about the court-martial that really speaks to me is the closing. He gives a really impassioned closing argument that I think is one of my favorite pieces of writing I've seen throughout early American writing, early American history. Because Robert Newburgh at this point says, okay, I realize that everyone thinks I'm a buggerer. I'm not going to change anybody's mind on this. I'm going to make the argument that it doesn't matter. He says, these rumors don't matter. You've told rumors about what I'm wearing. You've joked about my clothes. You've told all these nasty stories about me. Why does this matter? Why does this mean I can't be a chaplain in this unit? And that I find so moving, because that I think is really the heart of the Enlightenment. His way of saying the personal is not political. What I do in my personal life, what I may or may not do, how I dress, what I say, what rumors are said about me, these shouldn't matter to me doing my job and being treated equally to everyone else.
And how did the court-martial turn out? Were the officers moved by Newburgh's impassioned closing?
I don't know. Captain Chaplain is not moved by it, certainly. And I think some of the officers find it compelling. I don't want to give the entire story away, other than to say everybody is disappointed by the decision.
John, you said you hoped that Robert Newburgh and his court-martial proceedings would open a window onto the American Revolution and onto gay experiences during the Revolutionary era. But you also noted in Vicious and Immoral that Newburgh's windows onto these areas of early American life are imperfect. Why does Newburgh offer us imperfect windows into these areas of life? And what did his experiences in the British Army reveal about the Revolutionary period's perception of gayness and queerness?
It's an imperfect window. I think Robert Newburgh is an imperfect subject for asking this question about what is the relationship between homosexuality and the American Revolution? What role do queer or potentially queer people play in the creation of the United States? It's imperfect. One, because I'm not 100% sure that Robert Newburgh actually was a buggerer. There is no evidence he actually had sex with men. He himself kind of obfuscates. He never denies that he's had sex with a man, but nor does he ever admit to it. We're dealing with a lot of rumors. And I think the rumors are important because they get us to see how are people thinking about sexuality. And I think for me, that's one of the really interesting conclusions I took from this book and from this research, that I think I had this idea that ideas of queerness and homosexuality were really 20th century ideas, right? It's the lavender scare, these types of things. These are very 20th century ideas. No, in the 18th century, there was a full-on moral panic about men having sex with men. And a lot of the ideas that we associate with queerness today are alive and well in the 18th century. Again, that idea that Robert Newburgh can be identified as a buggerer, not because of what he's doing, but because of what he looks like, because of how he acts, how he relates to other men. None of this has to do with sex. It all has to do with character, or what we would call sexual identity. Those ideas are there. So I think that's one of the most interesting things I found. That the 18th century, they know that certain men have sex with men. They don't like it, but they know it's certainly part of creation, part of the world in which they live. The other thing that I really took from this book was, I think we do begin to see a separation on American versus British views on sexuality. And I don't want to overemphasize this point too much, but I would say by the 18th century, the British are in a full-on moral panic about men having sex with men. And this is certainly true in the ideas of the officers like Chaplain and Batt. They're really worried that a man accused of buggery is going to harm the reputation of the British Army, the British Empire, the entire scheme, moral order of which they're a part of. Americans, the colonists, they don't like homosexuality either. Sodomy is a capital crime in all 13 colonies. They don't like it. But there doesn't seem to be that same moral panic. We know that men aren't being prosecuted for sodomy in America at anywhere near the rates they're being prosecuted in England. And when they are prosecuted, rarely is anyone ever put to death in America. I think some of this has to do with there aren't cities the same way there are in England. We don't have molly houses in America the way you have in London. But I think there's also a sense of sort of a live and let live attitude in the American colonies. And I say that connect back to Newburgh's trial because I think we see this borne out in his enemies and his allies. So the men who were opposed to Robert Newburgh staying in the army, men like Thomas Batt and Benjamin Chaplain, they stayed loyal to king and country. They will fight in the American Revolution on behalf of the king. They serve out their tenure, will retire, move back to England, and live out their lives. They never give up their loyalty to the king. The men who support Robert Newburgh, Alexander Fowler, and Ensign Nicholas Trist, they will leave the British Army and become American citizens. Trist begins a plantation in Louisiana. Fowler moves out to Pittsburgh, where he becomes a merchant. Fowler becomes active in Democratic Republican politics, becomes very active in Thomas Jefferson's party in the early 1800s. So there is this division about whether you supported Newburgh or whether you opposed him. And that really sort of divides, I think, views on sexuality. The one person who contravenes all of this is, of course, Robert Newburgh himself. Robert Newburgh doesn't leave the British Army. He transfers to a different unit. He transfers to the 15th Regiment and will serve out the American Revolution as loyal to the King George III, loyal chaplain of the 15th Regiment. During the Revolution, he will retire, return to Ireland, and live out his life there. He never renounces Britain. He never renounces its imperial enterprise.
Well, John, now it's time for our segment 1776 in Context. Now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, in what ways do you think the American Revolution created opportunities for homosexual and queer individuals? And in what ways do you think it may have limited or closed opportunities for them?
Again, I think in terms of opportunities, I'm going to make much more of a strenuous case for opportunities here. But I think there was a resistance on the part of the colonists and later the American people against the sort of harsh rule against men who have sex with men. And probably my clearest evidence for this is always Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, founded by Quakers, did not want to make sodomy a capital crime. They have to because the British government says you have to do this. All laws in your colony have to follow British laws, and it's a capital crime in Britain. It's a capital crime in Pennsylvania. One of the first acts of Pennsylvania after independence is to repeal that. They don't get rid of the sodomy law, but they say we no longer want this law on our book saying a man should be put to death for having sex with another man. There is a push of Americans to say, we are imagining ourselves as a different world, as it having different morals, different priorities. They're not going to say, we want to be a place where men who have sex with men want to come and settle. No American is saying that. But I think they're open to the possibility that there doesn't need to be the same rule that had been in England in place in America. And I think some of this is also key to the revolution. The part of the revolution is about constraining the government, is about separating power, dividing power, saying things like morals should not be in the hands of the government. Some of this has to do with the disestablishment of the church. We don't want morals charges, who's having sex with who, to be held up in criminal court. Churches want to deal with it, that's fine. But criminal court people shouldn't be prosecuted for what they're doing personally. And I think there's a legacy of that, certainly, within the United States. The other side, the limits, the United States will, of course, also become this major power. We know that happens in the 19th and 20th century. It industrializes, it has urban areas. Homosexual population becomes much more conspicuous over the course of the 19th century and the 20th century, to the point that by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, we know that the United States looks a lot more like 18th century Britain. It's beginning to have a moral panic. It's beginning to fear that there are homosexuals everywhere, infiltrating the highest ranks of the government, and really see this as threatening not just to moral order, but the society as a whole. This is the sad part I always find. So the United States, I think, begins charting a very different path from Britain, and one that's going to be much more open and have possibilities for same-sex and queer individuals. By the 20th century, the United States and Britain are basically the same.
John, now that you've finished with Vicious and Immoral, are you working on a third book about the British Army in Revolutionary America, or are you shifting gears to a new topic?
I'm not writing a book right now. Books, as you know, take a long time to write. I'm not sure what I want my next 10-year commitment to be. So I'm doing more with queer history. So there were a couple of stories that came out of the Robert Newburgh book that I want to dig into more deeply. So I'm working on a couple of articles. One about Archbishop George Stone, who was Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland. And there's a great deal of pamphlets that are published about what a buggerer he is, which I think is really interesting sort of insight into how people are talking about this in the 1750s in Ireland. I'm also curious about the story of George Germain, or Lord George Sackville, who is the Secretary of State for the Colonies during the American Revolution, one of the minds behind the revolution. at least on the British side, trying to run this war. It has long been reported this man is a homosexual. And so I'm also following these pamphlets because several times in his life, these stories get reported about his same-sex affection. I'm curious what those are and what they tell us. Long term, I'm interested in these ideas of character. So in the context of Robert Newburgh, character really seems to be a stand-in for what we would call sexuality or sexual identity. That's not a one-to-one sort of comparison. It's a word that's approximating something else. But I'm curious more about character as an idea and how that's describing individuals in the 18th century and how that might be a way for us to think about how the individual is understood in the 18th century, apart from ideas of race, gender, or even sexuality.
And if we have more questions about our conversation today, where's the best place for us to get in touch with you?
Sure. You can find me through the Eastern Michigan University website, or you can email me directly at jmccurdy@emich.edu.
Well, John McCurdy, thank you so much for joining us and for introducing us to Robert Newburgh and what his life reveals about life and character in the mid to late 18th century British Army, and more about the period's perceptions of homosexuality.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
John McCurdy's exploration of Robert Newburgh's life and trials offers us a rare, deeply human glimpse into how early Americans and Britons understood queerness, morality, and identity in the 18th century. Now, we often assume that ideas about sexuality and identity are modern concerns. But as we just heard, the past is full of people who lived complicated, often vulnerable lives outside of the norms of British and early American society. Exploring the lives of people such as Robert Newburgh helps us better understand the origins of the cultural frameworks we often grapple with today in our own time. Now, Robert Newburgh's story isn't just about scandal and disgrace. It's a story about the fragile boundaries between private life and public reputation, between compassion and suspicion, and about how difference could serve as a source of fear or even empathy. By revisiting stories like Robert Newburgh's, we expand our understandings of the early American past to include the lives and experiences of those who were long kept at the margins. And by expanding our understanding, we gain a deeper, more inclusive view of the Revolutionary era, a view that reminds us that struggles for identity, belonging, and recognition aren't new, but enduring parts of the human experience. Look for more information about John, his book, Vicious and Immoral, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/414. If today's episode resonated with you, you liked it, please share it. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, how might recognizing stories like Robert Newburgh's change the way we understand the American Revolution and who it was for? Let's have a conversation about it. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.